Hey, legend. So I'm starting a new thing and I'm a little bit nervous to tell you about it, but I'm actually quite excited to see how it's received. I'm launching a new Support the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast initiative, and I'd love your support. For a small, once-off or monthly donation, you can help me continue to bring you the best, up-to-date, evidence-based nutrition information in the world. Now, absolutely no pressure, but if I've helped you a little bit over the years, it's a great way to say thanks. All you have to do is go to dietitianapproved.com/legend. And when you do, leave me a message, as I'd love to give you a shout out to say thanks. Welcome to the Triathlon Nutrition Academy podcast, the secret weapon in your ears for triathletes who want to get fitter, faster, stronger, and healthier with evidence-based nutrition. Joining me on the podcast today is researcher and fellow nutrition nerd, Sam Shepherd from all the way in the UK. Welcome, Sam.
Hello. Yeah, I can't say it's nice and sunny here, unfortunately, but we're heading into winter, so there you go. And I'm British, so I'll immediately start talking about the weather because that's what we love to talk about. So, but yeah, thanks for having me.
So funny. You're welcome. We are talking at my night time, your morning time, because the time difference between Australia and the UK sucks balls. So apologies if my voice gets croakier and croakier as we go. But Sam has promised to bring the energy, even though he's British. We won't hold that against him. And I did speak to my husband just before, who's in London at the moment, and he showed me the sky, and it was grey and it was dreary. But, you know, that's just a regular day in London.
Absolutely.
So Sam has agreed to come and talk to us on the podcast all about carbohydrate and fat oxidation. Oh yeah, we're going to get down and dirty in the good stuff. He has recently taken on a role and is now the head of sports science at Precision Fuel and Hydration, which is very exciting. But his background is, how many years of study have you done, Sam? Like 50 million?
Undergraduate, master's, PhD. So that's probably about 8 years altogether. And then 12 years in academia before making the switch to sort of industry, I suppose.
Yeah, total nerd. I love it. And that's like a term of endearment, right? But he has 60 publications to his name in what I would say is the most varied range of topics I've ever seen anyone research in. He calls himself a jack of all trades because he's got stuff in like lipid metabolism, glucose oxidation, diabetes, obesity, cardiorespiratory stuff, insulin resistance, like what else? All the things.
All the things, yeah. I mean, I suppose everything that underpins this is my interest in metabolism, exercise metabolism. And then it's just the application of that is what I would like to say.
Yeah, and you have a particular interest in something very, very nerdy that you tell me only 4 people in the world are interested in. Could you please explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I suppose it started in my PhD, and then I've been doing this type of work for probably up until the sort of last couple of years, really. When I was doing my PhD, we were really interested in lipid droplets or fat droplets in muscle, and how that's related to insulin resistance, but also how it's related to health. So there's something called the athlete's paradox, where if you're very healthy, you'll have a lot of fat in your muscle, but it's a substrate, as we'll kind of come onto through this podcast. But in a sedentary person, when they're insulin resistant, obese, or type 2 diabetic, then they also have a lot of fat, but it's just not usable. It's not particularly metabolic. And so that relates to the relative insulin resistance that those people experience. And so my interest in my PhD was working out why that was, what are the proteins that are linked to these lipid droplets in muscle, using microscopes to look at like muscle samples that we've taken out of all sorts of people, and like nice colourful pictures, which are great when you go to conferences and you can put them up and everyone goes, "Oh, wow." One of my PhD students actually termed it disco muscle, which I thought was really nice way of putting it. So, yeah, there's probably only about me and about 4 or 5 people in the world that really nerd out on that.
And look how excited you get talking about it too. You're like, yes, let's go. Somebody asked me a question.
Yeah.
Other than being a researcher weapon and lover of all things science, he is also a little bit of a weapon on the triathlon course. Sam was the overall winner of a full distance event in Mallorca in 2021. He beat all the men, all the pro men, I might add, What time did you do for that race, Sam?
Oh, it wasn't a quick one because it was so hot. So I was just the sort of last man standing, I think, more than like taking the win. But there you go. That we can talk about, heat acclimation and the importance of monitoring your workload in the heat. And I would say that's what I managed to do that day better than the others to come through.
Well done. Well done. And his fastest Ironman or full distance race time is 8:45 at that same race the year later. So it's it's not something to be sneezed at. That's a relatively fast full distance race.
Yeah, not too bad. So, I mean, hopefully we can get somewhere close to it next year. I actually did Tallinn Ironman in 2021 as well, and I went 9:01. So I need to go back and get some 9 there. Maybe that's the plan for next year.
And you have been to Kona the year after that, 2022. Is the plan to go back to Kona again?
That'd be nice. Hopefully 26, especially having just watched it this weekend and getting very excited about it, as always. I think that's what I grew up remembering, and that's probably my first recollection of seeing these guys on this nice, Hawaii, a nice island, doing something absolutely crazy. Yeah, and it's just growing from there, really.
It is such a cool event, and you've proved that you can perform in the heat too. So there's something about you that is probably more adapted to that environment, which is to your advantage.
Possibly, yeah. I definitely melted a little bit when I did it in 2022. So I'd like to go back and right some wrongs. Let's put it that way.
Think about all the things that you know now, though, that you could apply to yourself. N=1, you're always your own experiment. You would know so much more about that sort of stuff to help you for future racing.
Yeah, exactly. With Ironman racing, I really like it that you can't do that many a year, maybe 1 or 2 that you can peak for. And there's a little bit of jeopardy involved in that as well, because, we pay a lot of money to enter these races and it could all go terribly wrong, but you could also have the perfect day. And I think that's what I always think is one day it'll be possible to have the perfect day at one of these races. Not yet, but yeah, it will happen at some point.
Yep. And then it'll never happen again. It just happens
Exactly.
once.
Yeah.
We're going to get pretty deep on carbohydrate and fat oxidation, particularly for triathlon. We did have Professor Louise Burke come and talk to us about low carb, high fat and fat adaptation stuff way back in episode 79, if you do want to go and listen to that. That was back in February 2023. So I haven't really covered the fat oxidation, carbohydrate oxidation stuff too much since then. But we have so much to cover that what I'm going to do is break this episode into 2 parts. So part 1, we are going to focus mostly on carbohydrate oxidation. And then I'm going to get Sam back on and we're going to talk about fat oxidation in part 2. So hang on in there. I promise we're going to get super practical and not get too deep in all of the finer details of stuff so that you will be able to keep up and understand. Sam is really good at explaining the science in practical terms as well. So to kick us off, Sam, can you kind of explain the basics of carbohydrate and fat oxidation and how that contributes to our energy production, in particular in endurance sports and things like triathlon?
Yeah, so the basic principle is that the longer, we go as an endurance event when we're doing prolonged exercise, then the more that fat is going to contribute to our total energy expenditure. And we can look back at, there's a couple of really nice key studies that showed this back in the early 2000s. So Matt Watt, who is based in Australia, he did a study where they got people to cycle for 4 hours, just at a moderate intensity. And in this study, the crossover point was about 2 hours, where after 2 hours, fat became the dominant source of energy, whereas carbohydrate oxidation became lower after 2 hours. Before that point, carbohydrate was the dominant source. So that really showed this idea of a crossover and how prolonged exercise influences the proportion of energy that we're generating from fat and carbohydrate sources. And then there was this study a year later that came out from Luc van Loon, another really prominent researcher. It's probably one of the most cited papers, I think, ever in exercise metabolism, his paper in 2003. In this study from Luc van Loon, they just did 2 hours of exercise, but they used stable isotopes. And this allowed them to identify the sources of carbohydrate and fats that were being used during a moderate intensity bout of exercise. And so early on during that endurance exercise, then typically you use substrates that are available in your muscle. So primarily muscle glycogen, but then there's also some fat stored in there, as we kind of touched upon as well. And then as that exercise then continues and we go longer and deeper into that exercise bout, then you start to see a shift towards more use of plasma-based sources. And what we really mean by that is that over time, then we will be releasing more fatty acids from our adipose tissue stores, so our fat stores, and they're traveling to the muscle and being taken up and oxidized. We also see a greater proportion of energy coming from our glucose in the blood. And what we really mean by that is the glucose that's being broken down from liver glycogen stores and pumped out, and again, taken up and being used to generate energy. So that's the real basics, I suppose. And those are the two key studies that I always go back to kind of reflect on how does an endurance exercise bout influence substrate, the substrates that we're using. Now, in both of those scenarios, both of those studies are very controlled. And obviously, during an event, then the likelihood is we're going to take on carbohydrate during that event. And so that's going to maybe influence where that crossover point actually sits. So, if we take on more carbohydrate early on, then it might be that we remain more carbohydrate dependent, and carbohydrate provides a greater proportion of energy for longer into that endurance event. But that's the kind of basics in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, nice one. Thank you. Does the intensity of exercise then affect our substrate usage?
Absolutely. So, and again, there's another really great study from Luc van Loon, which looked at, again, using the stable isotope technique to look at the sources of carbohydrate and fat that have been burned at different exercise intensities. This was actually published a couple of years earlier, so 2001. Again, probably one of the most cited papers in that area. And they showed that, around 50% of your energy is coming from fat oxidation at, a moderate exercise intensity. The higher intensity that we go, then there's a greater proportion of energy coming primarily from muscle glycogen stores. So the harder we work, the more muscle glycogen we're going to burn to generate that energy, of course. Those are two very controlled studies. But again, if we apply that to what a race might look like, and most of the courses that we will ride on the bike in particular and maybe run, there's going to be some ups and downs. So it's either going to be undulating or there's going to be some severe hills. So the intensity will change naturally throughout that, as well as obviously it being a prolonged exercise bout. So it's not as quite clear cut as the lab studies would make you believe yet.
We're not particularly stable even in training. You might do efforts in a session, or you go up a hill and the intensity suddenly shifts and your oxidation of carbohydrate and fat suddenly shifts. So how can somebody know at an individual level what their carbohydrate and fat oxidation rates are at different intensities?
Yeah, so part of a physiological profiling of an athlete is do a graded exercise test. So we often split that into two parts. So a submaximal part of that test, and that's where we'd really start to determine what we might call fat max. So the intensity or the workload at which someone is burning their maximum fat oxidation sits at. And that's typically sort of somewhere in the region of 45 to maybe 65% of VO2 max. And then we can continue that track the change or the reduction in fat oxidation as exercise intensity goes up. So again, if we did a simple test on the bike, we might start off someone cycling at 90 or 100 watts, and then it would go up 30 watts every 4 or 5 minutes. And we can see how that changes substrate utilization, those increase in intensity. So naturally what we'll see with fat oxidation is it generally goes up a little bit and then will come down. Carbohydrate oxidation will continue to rise. So really the only way to truly know how much you are burning of both of those substrates is to go to a lab and have that tested using a metabolic cart where we're collecting that expired air, collecting information on the volume of oxygen that's being consumed, the volume of CO2 that's being produced, and then those two values go into equations to determine your rate of carbohydrate and fat oxidation. We can also use that technique coupled with a stable isotope to determine exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates as well. So exogenous carbohydrates are carbohydrates that are ingested essentially. So that's really important. If we want to understand the rate at which we use the carbohydrates that we ingest, then we would add a little bit of a tracer to those. So a tracer is basically a very similar it acts the same in terms of the molecule, acts exactly the same, but it's tagged slightly differently, slightly heavier. And then we can analyze that using sophisticated methods after the test. But what it ultimately tells us is the rate of oxidation of the ingested carbohydrate. So if we take 30 grams of carbohydrates in a gel, what rate are we burning that at? And that will alter depending on exercise intensity as well. But it still requires us to collect the expired air that we're breathing out, understand the volume of oxygen that we're consuming, and plugging it into similar equations to be able to do that. So that technique's really good. I would say the first thing I talked about there, the graded exercise test, that's relatively inexpensive for someone to go and do at a laboratory. Typically in the UK, we can do that at universities. Most universities offer that type of service. The exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rate is very expensive because the stable isotope tracers are expensive to buy and then analyze as well because of the mass spectrometry that we use to do those analyses. If you have the budget of someone like a Christian Blumenfeld or a Gustav Eden, you'll see those guys probably on YouTube doing that relatively often to understand what their exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates are. For us mere mortals, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that unless you have a lot of money to be able to invest in that. So yeah, that's not ideal. There are apps, I suppose, that are becoming more prominent now that at least claim to be able to work out how much carbohydrate you've burned during a session or how much fat you've burned during a session. They'll give you a ballpark figure, but also they're not built to take into account, changes in temperature, altitude, what your food intake was before and during that session, your fitness level. These are all different factors that are going to influence the contribution of fat and carbohydrate to your energy expenditure during a specific session. So they'll get you in the right region, but they're not particularly informative, in my opinion, at this point in time.
So if somebody gets that data, I don't know, they end up in a research study or something, or they pay to have that commercially done. They have their carbohydrate oxidation rates, they have their fat oxidation rates at different intensities. Are there factors that are going to affect that or change that? Or is that their number forevermore, set and forget?
No, it can definitely be changed. The main thing that will change it is their sort of training status or fitness level. So as we get fitter, then at the same intensity, we should be able to use more of our fat stores to generate energy versus our carbohydrate stores. If my fat max, for example, was something like 0.5 grams per minute, which is about average for your recreationally active to well-trained individual, for most people at least anyway, following a sort of normal, 65% carbohydrate diet. If I then did a period of endurance training, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, something like that, and came back and then retested, I would hope that one of the outcomes from that would be that my maximal fat oxidation would have increased, maybe up to like 0.6 or 0.7 grams per minute, either at the same power. So if it occurred at 150 watts, for argument's sake, in the first test, and then the second test, it also occurred at 150 watts, that would be okay. Or the ideal scenario is we'd actually be using more fat at a slightly higher power this time. So maybe like 180 or 200 watts. So that means that we're generating energy a little bit more efficiently and protecting our carbohydrate stores essentially for the same sort of level of effort, let's say. Yeah.
I find that so interesting. And what I want you to take away from that is that if you are less fit or you're coming back from, I don't know, Christmas and New Year period and not doing a lot of training, or you've been sick or injured and not done a lot of training, or you're new to the sport, then your carbohydrate needs are higher than somebody that is fitter and faster and well-trained.
The other point I should make here that some people often take away from this is that, okay, so I go to a lab, I get this test and it tells me my fat max is 0.5 grams per minute. And then they extrapolate that out into a, 4 or 5 hour ride. That's all they're ever going to burn, 0.5 grams per minute. But actually remember, right at the start, we talked about how exercise duration, so the longer we go, the more that fat will contribute to our energy needs during a sort of endurance type exercise bout. So yeah, it might be that you start off at like 0.4 or 0.5 grams per minute. The longer you get into that exercise bout, it's going to go slightly higher. So, maybe after 2 or 3 hours, you're going at sort of 1 gram per minute. So the thing to take away is that you can't go to the lab and say, okay, at 150 watts, I'm going to burn 0.5 grams per minute of fat and 1.5 grams per minute of carbs. People take that away and think that can influence their race strategy because they know how many carbs they're burning. It doesn't quite work like that because of the fact, factors, well, the main factor being that exercise duration will influence that relationship and that will shift over time.
So we all just need massive budgets and all the money in the world to sit in a lab and do as much testing as someone like Blumenfeld or, the Tour de France riders. They are pretty heavily dialed in, right? They have so much money and science backing to get all that stuff right. I think it's very, very cool and very interesting. So fitness is the main driver of those things?
Yeah, fitness is one of the main drivers of those things. There are some small differences when we look at things like sex. So we know that females at the same sort of relative exercise intensity use a little bit more fat than males do. If you go to altitude, so I can speak a little bit about that because luckily I was at Font Romeu in the Pyrenees a couple of weeks ago with some Hoka runners. And it was good to see that they were aware that their carbohydrate requirements were going to be higher at altitude because you're working, relatively harder. So the intensity of the exercise is generally higher. Therefore, you're going to use more carbohydrates. So they need to fuel a bit higher during those sessions to try and overcome and compensate for that. Temperature obviously is going to influence that as well. So we've just seen Kona the last weekend, just gone. People are going to be using more carbohydrate in heat unless they dial back the intensity that they're riding at, which we obviously didn't see with some of the guys. Hence why they were walking on the run and various things. So those are the kind of some of the main things that are going to influence it. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit as well. Probably the key factor is our habitual diet, as well as kind of training status. Whether we have a high carb diet or a lower carb, high fat diet is going to play a big role in what the substrate is that we use during exercise.
Yeah, I will ask you that question. But before we dive into that, I want to get your take on the 120 grams of carbs an hour, trend, if you want to call it a trend, that we're seeing everywhere because there's some literature around, elite level off-road marathon runners, like trail runners, chewing through that much carbohydrate, and everything always trickles down to age group athletes. And it seems like the focus for people at the moment is like more is better. Let's all aim for 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour. Why would somebody that is an age group triathlete want to aim that high? And I guess on the flip side, why would you then not want to do that in other situations?
I suppose let's just dial it back a little bit first, just so we're all starting from the same position here. So where that 120 grams has actually come from. So first of all, we should say that we think that the maximum absorption capacity of the gut to take up glucose is about 1 to 1.1 gram per minute. So that's where this idea, if you had only glucose, you could ingest and absorb and oxidize about 60 grams per hour. And then we knew, back in the early 2000s that if you added fructose to glucose, then we could increase that up to sort of about 90 grams per hour. It's worth thinking about those studies actually, because in those first studies, they actually fed their participants about 108, 110 grams of carbs per hour. And that was, again, a combination of glucose and fructose. And when they did that, they observed oxidation rates of 1.5 grams per minute. So 1.5 times 60 gives you 90 grams per hour. So that's where that 90 grams an hour has come from. And in recent years, we thought, can we push that a little bit higher? So those initial studies had a ratio of 2 to 1 glucose to fructose. So 60 grams of glucose, 30 grams of fructose, for example. More recent studies have looked at using a slightly different ratio, so 1 to 0.8 for glucose to fructose, and that's meant that we can push it slightly higher. And that's the basis of those studies that are showing that maybe 120 grams an hour is possible. It's also worth saying that the maximum, or at least on average, the maximum oxidation rates that they observe in those studies is still about 1.5 grams per minute. So there's maybe a little bit of redundancy, you could say, in doing that. You could actually bring it back down. And this is worth considering from an age group perspective. if you want to maximize your carbohydrate oxidation rates, you could probably actually aim for somewhere in the region of 100 to 110 grams per hour. And you would still be pretty close, theoretically, to those maximum oxidation rates. And obviously, you're reducing a little bit of potential gut issues by putting something in that isn't getting absorbed and oxidized. And that might not seem like a lot. We're talking about 10 grams there, maybe. But if you extrapolate that out over 5 or 6 hours of an Ironman bike, then you're potentially carrying 50 to 60 grams extra carbs in the gut that aren't actually being used. And yes, there's going to be some carry through into the run there, of course, but there's also potential for GI issues that come alongside that. So there's a gut training element of that as well. I think, and it's interesting that you noted the ultra running study that actually fed 120 grams an hour, because that was probably one of the first ones to show that. And it's interesting that it was in runners. Now, anecdotally, and with the cyclists that we work with at Precision, we see regularly they're doing 120, even 130, 140 grams an hour. And I think in cycling, it's a little bit easier to meet those numbers and hit those numbers. There's also a reason to try and do that, particularly, when they're racing like multi-day or multi-stage races. There's an element of, if you fuel higher today, you're not digging such an energy hole, let's say, that you can't then recover for the next day. And so that's part of the reason to go pretty high on those days as well. Interestingly, though, and it's probably at Western States Marathon this year when I was first exposed to this and saw this, that if you take ultra runners, even those guys, they're running for 10, 12, 15 hours. Even those guys are hitting around 100 grams an hour, which is incredible. And also, we should say that that's largely from sports nutrition products like gels or chews, which to me seems unfathomable. And particularly, my assumption was always that there would be some real food in there to mix things up, but they're just, no. Probably the best example of that is Hayden Hawkes, who won CCC at UTMB this year, and he was third this year at Western States. He was, about 100 grams an hour purely from gels over, a 10 to 14 hour period, which is just immense. We're talking there at the top level, of course, and those guys are really pushing the limits. And we'll probably repeat this point. It ultimately comes back to, what intensity do you think you're going to try to complete an event at? And that will, to some extent, determine how much carbohydrate you try to consume. So if you're aiming to complete an Ironman in 15 hours, the relative intensity is going to be much lower than one of the pros trying to do sub 8, for example. They're going to be working at a much higher intensity to do that. So there's a reason to have such high carbohydrate intakes for those guys. If you're, if the intensity of that exercise and that race is going to be much lower for you, then you could probably dial that back, and you will naturally use more of your fat stores to generate the energy to be able to keep you going essentially during that race. I'm not saying that fueling isn't important. Of course, it's still important, but you could dial that back maybe to 60 or 70 grams an hour if the intensity of that race is going to be a little bit lower as well. So I think it all comes back to considering this on an individual basis. And yes, there's some level of what can you tolerate, because that's a big part of it, but also what do you think you're actually going to need as well, based on your target and aims for the race.
So you alluded to this before, but what part of somebody's day-to-day nutrition is going to dictate how good they are at oxidizing carbohydrate or oxidizing fat?
There was actually quite a nice modeling study done of this a few years ago from Dan Plews and Jeff Rothschild over at AUT. And they took heaps of data basically and looked at what factors would influence RER. So RER is the respiratory exchange ratio, and we can use that as an indicator of how much carbohydrate we're using or how much fat we're using, or at least the proportion of either or. So an RER of 1, in theory, would tell us that we're burning 100% carbohydrate. An RER of 0.7 would tell us that we're burning entirely fat. And so, 0.85 would say 50-50, basically. And you get that from going back to the lab tests, you would get that information from those tests, because it's just a ratio of VO2 to VCO2, essentially. So, when they took all that data and looked at what factors would influence RER, exercise duration was a key one. But the other key one was habitual diet. So if you have a higher fat diet, then naturally you will burn more fat during exercise. And equally, if you have a higher carbohydrate diet, there will be a tendency to use carbohydrate more. And obviously we can change that based on our habitual diet. So if we suddenly decide that we want to play with low carbohydrate, high fat diets, for example, then we might start to see a shift to using more fat as a fuel. And equally, if we maintain most people have a fairly high carbohydrate diet, then carbohydrate is going to be one of the more dominant sources. That's the main thing, really. There is some evidence that gut health is going to be important in that as well. So it's not just how much fat you have or how much carbohydrate you have, it's also the quality of our diet, of course. We need to look after our gut microbiome. So if we've got poor gut health, that's going to definitely have an influence on how well we, absorb and then use either fat or carbohydrate, essentially. So, it's important that we get sufficient things like fiber in our diet, for example, to support good gut health. But it's a proportion of carbohydrate and fat, which is going to be a big determinant of how much of that we then use during exercise.
I've been trying to keep an eye on that gut health space because I just find that so interesting. I'm always banging on to athletes about eating more fruits and vegetables, but there is method to the madness. Particularly for you guys in the UK, your diet is shithouse, no offense. You guys do not eat enough fruits and vegetables. You really need to pick up your game for the rest of the world.
Wow, okay. I mean, I'm just looking at a fruit bowl now on our work surface, so I can't comment for the rest of the UK. We're doing all right here at Precision.
So to take you back to carbohydrate and fat oxidation, we can change that like relatively quickly. And I know Louise Burke has done a lot of stuff in, low carb, high fat and flipping somebody's oxidation rates with diet. I don't know how to ask this question properly because I know so many age group triathletes, want to dabble in the low carb, high fat thing. They talk about, being fat adapted and improving that. Is that something that they should be looking at doing to get better at burning fat, particularly more long course athletes? Or is it a bit of a waste of time and a gimmick?
The $1 million question. The first thing that I would say to someone who came to me and asked that question, I would look at across, what does their actual life look like? So if they have a family and they're cooking as a family, is the family prepared to, adopt that same low carb, high fat diet? Do they do a lot of preparation of their meals, or do they try and, are they grabbing food on the fly when they're, in and out of the office, for example? Because it seems to me that we're in quite a carbohydrate heavy environment. So if you're trying to pick up lunch, you're going to have very limited options to sustain a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. And we probably should define that to start with, at least anyway, is that, ideally a low carb, high fat diet should have less than 50 grams of carbs per day. That's incredibly difficult unless you are well planned and well prepped for every day to be able to sustain that. If you can do that, then hats off to you to start with. But if you can do that, then I think there probably is some benefit to, let's say, dabbling with it and seeing if it fits for you. We know that strategy is going to increase your ability to use fat as a fuel. So more of your energy is going to be generated from your fat stores as a result of doing that. That's like unequivocal. And as you alluded to, Louise has shown that can happen quite quickly as well. The other aspect of that is that when you adopt that dietary strategy, you're often compromising your abilities to do like the high intensity work. Now that might be fine to some extent, but we know that, fitness and VO2 max, and if you're trying to do VO2 max type sessions or workable threshold to improve your VO2 max, that requires a lot of carbohydrate to actually achieve that. And we know that VO2 max is, probably one of the key determinants of performance, whatever level of an athlete you are. There's no right straightforward answer for that, unfortunately. And I'm sort of skirting around saying yes or no, because I don't think you can. It's a bit of a grey area. I think it's very individual. And I think it goes back to what your aims are as an athlete. And, if you're aiming to compete at the top end and go, sub 8, sub 9 in an Ironman, for example, then I think you're probably going to need a heavy component of your diet to consist of carbohydrate, because you're not typically going to be able to do the high end work that's required to go that fast. If you're at the lower end, and again, we can look at this from an athletic perspective, but also from a health perspective, then maybe low carb, high fat approach is potentially a good strategy. We know it's not a bad thing for health, particularly, when we, in my former life as an academic, when we were doing some, looking at overweight or obese people or type 2 diabetics, there's pretty good evidence that a low carb, high fat diet can help with that insulin sensitivity or reducing that insulin resistance. So it could be an option. I also think, and this is where it comes, we have an athletic life, let's say, but maybe we stopped competing. And then, if we have a high carbohydrate diet, maybe that's not optimal for what we, if we then create a sedentary state for ourselves. Ideally, we don't do that, of course, and we keep moving, but we might not be competing or completing events. So, I'm sort of going all around the houses here to say that it's a grey area. I think if you can commit to it, and that's the other thing to say, if you can commit to a low carb, high fat lifestyle, I will call it, not even a diet, a lifestyle, then I think there's some potential benefits depending on your ambitions, your level as an athlete, and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, you're a perfect politician, right? No straight answer. I love that you led with the lifestyle thing first, though, and I love that also a dietitian on the other side of the world has the same mindset around this with athletes. I've only ever met 2 athletes in my entire career that have maintained and benefited from a low-carb, high-fat lifestyle. Everyone else has wanted to do it because it's sexy, but cannot maintain it for longer than a couple of weeks to, a couple of months. And they uproot their entire life and their family, and they discover how hard it is to eat out, and they can't do any social things, and they can't go drinking with their mates and things like that. And they're like, screw it, it's too hard. It's not worth it. So I think it's definitely something to consider first and foremost before you start chasing shiny objects and jumping down rabbit holes to get a marginal performance gain if it's going to affect your entire life.
Absolutely. I mean, I suppose I'm saying that based on some experience as well. I actually dabbled myself a few years ago. Yeah, it wasn't an enjoyable 3 months, if I'm being perfectly honest. It just didn't fit for me as an athlete.
Did you notice any performance gains off the back of that then?
It's difficult to say. So I actually had a 10K race a week into it, and I ran pretty fast. But equally, that's the first time I wore a pair of super shoes as well. So, we can't put it all down to the
scrap that.
To the diet.
No. Too many confounding variables to your research study there. That's not good data.
Yeah. No. But the main thing for me was that it just didn't fit with the life that I was leading, I suppose, at the time, and my lifestyle generally. I'm fairly good at preparing, food and things like that. But as soon as you have a few busy days and you fall behind on that, you're almost scrabbling, a bit like you do with work sometimes. You're out of the LCHF sort of lifestyle, let's say. It's difficult to get back to it.
I would love to keep talking, Sam. So what I might do is we're going to wrap up part 1 of the carbohydrate oxidation information. So many good little tidbits and practical applications there. I love, as a researcher, being able to talk to you that you can just pull research studies out of your brain and be like, they did this and they did this. I don't ever retain that stuff. I read it. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Now, how do I apply it? And what is then my advice to somebody? And then I lose all the detail from those papers. And I love somebody that can just pluck that out of their brain. So let's wrap up part 1. Thank you for listening to all about carbohydrate oxidation. I'm going to come back with part 2 with Sam, and we're going to keep diving down this low carb, high fat, fat oxidation and fat adaptation type strategies when it comes to endurance performance. So thank you so much, Sam, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me. Speak to you soon.